Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War history. Today we focus on one of the units that will just seem to have fits of bad luck. The 16th Connecticut Infantry Regiment earned the nickname the Hard Luck Regiment due to a series of unfortunate events and severe hardships they faced during the Civil War. The regiment was thrust into the Battle of Antietam shortly after being formed, with little training and preparation. The battle was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, and the 16th Connecticut suffered heavy casualties. In April of 1864, the regiment was captured en masse at the Battle of Plymouth, North Carolina. Many of the soldiers were then sent to the notorious Andersonville prison, where they endured horrific conditions, including disease and starvation. From the beginning, the regiment faced challenges due to inadequate training and preparation. They were issued their weapons just a day before the first battle and had no prior experience in combat, and it all went downhill from there. The Battle of Antietam on September 17th, Major General George B. McClellan confronted Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which had invaded Maryland with the hopes of replenishing its troops as well as turning the tide of the Civil War. The resulting battle was the bloodiest single day of the entire war. Earlier that morning, Private Ira Forbes and Robert Kellogg awoke to read the Bible and pray. Orders swiftly came to fall in, and fighting began at dawn. Confederate batteries began shelling their position. As Corporal Samuel B. Melter of Company C described, "We were lying under a hill, but their shot came so fast and so sure that we were obliged to run to the woods for protection, many falling from the enemy's shots as they ran." To Private Max Nessner of Company G, the artillery fire came like rain, round shot, shells, shrapnel, grape and all. The regiment fell flat, and the shot went over them. At least an hour went by, and then the regiment moved to a cornfield to wait for 2 more hours. The Battle of Antietam had commenced, and the noise of the shot and shell grew so loud that the men had to shout to talk. We had, Private George Robbins recalled, a magnificent view of the long battlefield, stretching away to our right along the undulating country as far as the eye could see, with masses of blue-clad soldiers showing for a moment, then out of sight as the hills hid them from view. The early morning shock of being fired upon by enemy artillery had made it abundantly clear that the regiment was about to go into battle. Exactly when and where they would engage, however, remained a mystery. The waiting only seemed to make things worse. As hours slipped away, a few restless souls wandered off to pick peaches. Others had already been directly touched by fire. Kellogg had received a slight wound in the arm. A shell fragment had cut out Chaplain Peter Finch's coat pocket, and Sergeant Abner Warren's horse had been shot out from under him. The battle's frightening sounds and sights made some feel faint and weak, and when noon sick call came, they vanished to the rear. Private George N. Lamphere explained, "The fact is well known to all soldiers that one of the most trying positions troops can be put into is to be lying around inactive and yet be under fire. It requires courage, and it is a great consumer of nerve power." Sergeant William Ralia scornfully recalled that many of those suddenly sick just before battle were the loudest braggarts, who had vowed they would kill the regiment's widely disliked Colonel Francis Beach. Rid of the regimental rubbish, Riley alleged, the 16th was then free from everything that would or could tarnish our good name, clear of all weakening influences, now ready for the ordeal that awaited us. Few in the 16th Connecticut, however, were ready what they would soon face. By late afternoon, the 16th was sent south to try to outflank the Confederates and find a crossable ford on the Antietam Creek. The men crossed the creek about a mile below Burnside's bridge, holding their guns and cartridge boxes high over their heads. Some later contended that the water was shoulder deep. After hurrying up the side of a hill to support a Union battery, officers ordered the men to hit the ground immediately. Rebel cannons took deadly aim on their position, pounding them with grape, canister, and railroad iron. The hill's crest protected most of the unit, but the artillery fire injured about a dozen of the men. A few privates joked nervously, seeking to break the thickening tension. Colonel Beach barked impatiently at the jokesters, silencing any attempts at levity. Between 3:30 and 4 p.m., the brigade's commander, Colonel Edward Harlan, waited with increasing impatience for the 16th Connecticut and 4th Rhode Island to advance. The 8th Connecticut had already moved forward some distance to the right of the regiments, creating a gap between the units. Harlan sent an aide to push the remainder of his brigade forward, and Brigadier General Isaac P. Rodman intervened personally to hasten the men along. Rodman discovered the 16th Connecticut still on the ground near the edge of a cornfield, and as he began to converse intently with Colonel Beach, he spotted enemy movement to the left of the cornfield. Rodman rushed back to find the 4th Rhode Island, while Beach quickly ordered the regiment into formation. Because the color-bearer forgot to take the flag out of its dark glazed bag, the regiment entered its first battle, essentially waving a black flag. It was an eerie premonition of what was to come. "Attention!" Beach bellowed. From atop his white horse, riding up and down the lines, trying frantically to shift half of the regiment to refuse its left in order to protect its exposed flank. A wave of bullets suddenly whizzed through the ranks. As Kellogg recalled, it was one of the most terrifying volleys of musketry that I think was ever poured into a regiment. Our men, he wrote, fell on every side. Maneuvering soldiers under fire is difficult for any officer to complete, but directing an undrilled and undisciplined regiment such as the 16th Connecticut was nearly impossible. The line officers were just as green and confused as the privates. One officer cried out in desperation, "Tell us what you want us to do, and we'll try to obey you." "I want my men to face the enemy," Beach replied. The tall, uneven cornstalks compounded the chaos. Men could only see a small portion of their line at a time. A few fell out of formation, losing track of their companies. Nearing a wooded fence, officers issued conflicting orders. "Tear the fence down!" and "Never mind the fence." Only a few minutes had passed, but it seemed like an eternity. As the officers struggled to find some order and direction, Confederate troops unleashed a deadly crossfire. So dense was the corn, wrote South Carolinian James F.J. Caldwell, that the lines sometimes approached within 30 to 40 yards of each other before firing. Another South Carolinian, Barry Benson, recalled running through the corn, shooting a galling fire into the fleeing foe. Benson saw bunches of frightened bluecoats crowded into a small hollow at the bottom of the hill, afraid to cross the open slope behind them. Grouped here in a crouching, disorderly line, he remembered, we poured into them volley after volley, doubtless with terrible execution. Other Federals huddled behind a stone fence, sporadically breaking away in small groups individually, and fleeing to the rear. Some members of the regiment recalled firing only one round, and others alleged an actual charge was made. At least one soldier later recounted hearing the hideous rebel yell. Others remembered hearing orders to fall back, but it remains unclear whether there was ever any official call to retreat. No matter, the 16th Connecticut broke and fled in wild panic. The 4th Rhode Island, which had come up on the 16th's left, held out a little longer before it too retreated in confusion. Caught up in the swarm of panicked soldiers, Beach stubbornly fought to regain control. He attempted to rally a small remnant of his regiment with portions of the 11th Connecticut and redraw a battle line. But little could be done. Most of the 16th Connecticut's ranks were dead, wounded, or absent from the field. Drooping from mental and physical exhaustion, stragglers slept the night of September 17th under fences, on rocks, and in thickets. Many wounded remained on the field all night into the next day. Exactly 19 months later, the 16th Connecticut faced its second major engagement of the war, and this time things seemed entirely different. The men were more experienced and hardened, less idealistic about war, but they were no more prepared for a Confederate onslaught than they were on the fateful day in Maryland, and the results, like at Antietam, were devastating. Rather than panicking and fleeing from the field, however, the regiment and the entire Federal garrison was surrounded and captured. It was a beautiful Sabbath morning, Sunday, April 17, 1864, remembered musician Robert Holmes, and the men of the 16th Connecticut Infantry went through their regular routine without any indication of what lay ahead. Sergeant Oliver Gates recalled how, that morning, our regiment lay in camp at Plymouth, North Carolina, and none of us expected an attack. But by the time the day closed, we were surrounded by 12,000 Confederate soldiers and General Robert Hoke. At noon, Union cavalry reported seeing the enemy just a few miles away. Private Robbins wrote in his diary that it had been a bright, pleasant day, but the Sabbath had been desecrated by the rebels. At about 5 p.m., the 16th Connecticut had just marched onto the parade ground for dress parade when a courier rushed into camp, reporting an enemy attack. Private Lanphier was among the skirmishers ordered to make a reconnaissance. We went out, Lanphier recalled, in front across the esplanade, to the edge of the timber, and a little beyond came upon the enemy in force. They pressed upon us and compelled us to fall back. We held out stubbornly, dodging behind stumps and logs and firing at the enemy all the way to our line of works. Within a few hours, all the skirmishers had returned to camp, and the rebel attack was in full force. General Hoke was at the head of a combined land and naval operation that outnumbered the Federals nearly 4-1. The 16th Connecticut, totaling about 400 men, manned Fort Williams at the center of the Union breastworks. Our position, Robbins noted, was on the west bank of the Roanoke River, about 8 miles from its mouth, protected by log breastworks from the attack of the enemy, running from the river in a circular form and encompassing the small town at a point some 2/3 of a semicircle, leaving the space on the river on the south protected by light gunboats, of which 3 were anchored abreast of the town. Kellogg wrote a short letter to his father at 8 p.m., a few hours after the assault began. "We are having an interesting time of it," he urged his father to be firm in their Christian faith. "Don't be anxious on my account. God will keep me. Trust him." Leyland Barlow also scribbled a quick note to his sister that evening. "The Rebs showed themselves at about 5 p.m., and we are having a right smart artillery fight. Never fear," he hastily closed. Lanphier recalled that he and his comrades were confident at first, since they were on high ground and their works were defended by good 12-pound brass howitzers and an abundance of ammunition. The troops, he wrote, were in good spirits. In fact, we were in a state of the highest enthusiasm, as we were to fight behind breastworks, and we felt that we could whip 4 to 5 times our number, and we could and did for 2 days. The swamp lay before them, about 900 yards wide, with felled logs sprawling in all directions over the miry and boggy ground. The Confederate assault, however, was unrelenting. By 11 p.m., Company H of the 16th Connecticut was ordered to escort all loyal women, children, and other non-combatants aboard the steamer Massasoit, which was headed for Roanoke Island. Private Forbes bitterly complained in his diary that the Confederates attacked without first allowing the non-combatants to leave, and have thereby violated one of the principles of civilized warfare. Meanwhile, Confederate artillery continued blasting away until nearly midnight, and then resumed firing just before sunrise the next morning. Soon rebel soldiers began pouring out of the woods and overpowering the Union skirmish lines, forcing the Federals to retreat inside their forts. Following a sharp engagement between a rebel battery and the men in Fort Wessels on the Union right, there was a short respite. Then, around 3 p.m., Forbes wrote, the enemy moved forward in a line of battle on the Washington Road. This movement was checked, but the Confederates advanced again, driving our pickets and skirmishers, and opened up on us from a battery which they succeeded in planting in a fine position. For about 3 hours, the Confederate guns blasted away at Fort Williams until they were finally silenced, and our picket line was again established. Forbes judged that they were splendid shooting on both sides, with the Federals taking relatively slight casualties. Confederate artillery and gunboats unleashed a withering fire that did not stop until 10 p.m. At one point, a battery planted itself directly in front of the regiment's position, and according to Kellogg, blazed away with the greatest rapidity upon our camp in Fort Williams. Sergeant Samuel Grosvenor wrote it was one of the most furious cannonades he had ever witnessed. Under the blizzard of fire, men began to falter and struggled to keep their composure. Lieutenant Colonel John Burnham attempted to soothe the regiment's nerves by ordering the band to play national airs. At first, this seemed to work. Kellogg later remembered, brave hearts became braver, and if the patriotism of any waxed cold and the courage of any faltered, they here grew warmer and stronger until the pride of country had touched the will and an abominable principle had been kindled that virtually declared the man a hero until death. But before long, Confederate artillery took aim at the musicians, and the shells began to drop over their heads. At this moment, Kellogg recalled, the musicians retired precipitately, the bass drummer throwing his sticks in one direction and his drum in another, leaving the defense of the breastworks to the boys with the rifles. As the enemy fire persisted into the night, Kellogg sought solace in faith. God has given me courage and calmness. I try to trust in Jesus Christ. May his will be done. Years later, Forbes gave credit to Burnham's cool conduct during the siege. He was a man of unquestioning bravery and held his men in perfect discipline, awaiting the charge. With the siege continuing into a third day, the Federal outlook seemed bleak. It was evident to us, Lieutenant Bernard Blakeslee later wrote, that we must either be killed or go to Libby. Kellogg declared on April 19th, this morning finds us in a rather bad plight. Earlier, the Confederate ram Albemarle had slipped past the Federal guns and sunk the USS Southfield, in the process driving off other Union gunboats and cutting off the position from outside communication. We are surrounded, Chaplin wrote in his diary. At one point, Major Henry L. Pasco ordered Lieutenant Alonzo Case to select a group of men and hold them in readiness to charge over the works in case the rebels came up to them in our front. Case was convinced few would return from such an extremely dangerous mission and initially offered the task to his own Company E, which consisted of about 40 men. To his surprise, every member of the company volunteered. I was proud of that company at that time, he wrote. They were more brave than I. I was ordered to go. They volunteered. Fort Wessel eventually fell, and Albemarle began shelling the town. We went to work, Lanphier wrote, throwing up earthworks to defend us from the riverside, and soon had some protection. Soldiers were ordered to begin digging for our lives, building traverses, bomb-proofs, etc. The men and their commanders never questioned such defensive behavior as unheroic or cowardly. It was simple survival. Firing continued into the dark, and the men had another sleepless night, anxious about what awaited them. The Rebs evidently intended to take us, Grosvenor predicted bleakly. On Wednesday morning, the 16th was ordered to provide reinforcements on the left. In doing so, Lanphier wrote, we had to pass through the village, and as we reached a point a little past Fort Williams, we discerned, not clearly, as it was not yet light, a black line within our defenses. We were formed in a line of battle, and we marched cautiously toward it, and being sufficiently near, discharged a broadside into their ranks, getting the first shot. The order was to fall back and to reload while so marching, with the face toward the enemy. This order was executed promptly. Lanphier was in the process of loading his gun when murderous musketry fire from the enemy, who advanced on the run, tore through the ranks. Hit in the left arm by a Minié ball, Lanphier dropped his rifle. Ordered to head back to a hospital tent, he later recalled, I did reach the tent, and it did not seem to me more than 10 minutes until the whole place swarmed with the enemy, who came pell-mell, tearing and swearing and firing without much regard to the sanctity of the hospital flag, and the tent was riddled with bullets. Separated from the regiment, Lanphier and a few wounded comrades were captured. He never saw his unit again. Moved first to the state capital of Raleigh, then to Salisbury, North Carolina, and then to Libby Prison in Richmond. His left arm was amputated on May 22nd. In the meantime, the rebels pressed forward to take the town and began pounding Fort Williams from every direction. There was another flurry of fighting, and the artillery fire was perfectly awful. As the day unfolded, the Confederates demanded surrender, according to Lieutenant Blakeslee, on 3 occasions in order, to save further sacrifice of life, but each time the Confederates were rebuffed. After the third offer, Hoke defiantly declared, I will fill your citadel full of iron. I will compel you to surrender, if I have to fight until the last man. I was now completely enveloped on every side, Brigadier General Henry Wessler later reported. Fort Williams, an enclosed work in the center of the line, being my only hope. This was well understood by the enemy, and in less than an hour a cannonade of shot and shell was opened upon it from 4 directions. This terrible fire had to be endured without reply, as no man could live at the guns. Wessels decided that he had no more options. This condition of affairs could not be long endured, and in compliance with the earnest desire of every officer, I consented to hoist a white flag, and at 10 a.m. of April 20th, I had the mortification of surrendering my post to the enemy with all it contained. General, this is the saddest day of my life, Wessels reportedly observed to Hoke, who responded, General Wessels, this is the proudest day of mine. Sergeant Jacob Bauer later asserted that after the surrender, a member of his Company G still had his gun and aimed to fire it at a Confederate general who was on horseback. Another soldier stopped him. It was good luck, Bauer maintained, because had a Reb been killed after the surrender, they would have killed us all. Instead, the Rebs took us all, Grosvenor scrawled in his diary that day. Indeed, nearly the entire regiment was captured except for Company H and a scattering of men on detached service. The regiment's casualties, except for those captured, were relatively light, 1 killed and 12 wounded. After the war, Kellogg concluded the comparatively small loss of the 16th at Plymouth was by reason of its fighting behind defenses for the first time in its history. The attacking Confederate forces, fighting in the open, sustained losses so heavy that they were never reported in detail. Thanks for watching this episode of Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Like, follow, and click the bell for notifications to ensure you see all the latest content. As always, let me know if there's any other important events of the American Civil War you would like me to address.